Sometimes, life works in mysterious ways, as if a higher force really wanted to demonstrate that what goes around, comes around. For better or for worse. And today we will tell the incredible story of a man whose life was changed because of a simple gesture. Every day, after work, John would take the bus home. He worked in a factory and some days were really tough. He almost always fell asleep on the way, and his co-workers would wake him up so he wouldn't miss his stop. However, this time John was alone and it seemed like he was going to end up missing his stop and having to walk half an hour back home. That's when a pleasant, feminine voice said, "Hey, your stop is next, you're going to miss it." John opened his eyes and saw a beautiful woman next to him. "Thank you very much," said John. "But how do you know which stop is mine?" The woman smiled and said that it wasn't the first time she had seen his co-workers wake him up. She lived 3 stops away from his, and apparently they both left work at similar times. John chose to stay on the bus and get off at the same stop as the woman while they were talking. He found out that her name was Jessica and they had some things in common. The conversation was pleasant, and they decided to meet again the next day. The two started dating, and 8 months later, John proposed to Jessica, and she said yes. In love, they had a daughter named Sara a few years later, who became the reason for their lives. The girl's carefree childhood was interrupted when her mother began experiencing frequent symptoms of a lung disease. Jessica chose to treat herself at home using medication to alleviate her symptoms, postponing medical appointments. This attitude caused arguments between the couple, as John believed that the problem was simple and did not agree with Jessica's approach of not investigating the case. However, Jessica always managed to convince him with an optimistic outlook on her health. If John had known the outcome, he would not have allowed Jessica to postpone the appointments for so long. Some time later, the bill arrived. Jessica woke up feeling dizzy, but decided to ignore the symptoms and followed her normal morning routine. However, a few hours later, her condition worsened dramatically and John had to call an ambulance. Fortunately, as soon as the ambulance arrived, the doctors assured John that she would recover well. Jessica accompanied the doctors in the ambulance and ended up falling into a coma during the journey to the hospital, being taken directly to the ICU. While on the way to the hospital, Sara asked, "How is Mom, Dad? Is she going to be okay?" John responded with conviction, "Of course she is, sweetheart." However, when they arrived in the hospital lobby, the on-duty nurse stopped them from going any further. A few minutes later, an older doctor called John, held his hand, and said, "We are very sorry, but your wife passed away shortly after being admitted. Her condition was very advanced, her lungs were already severely compromised, and there was nothing more we could do. Be strong." John left without hearing the doctor's last words and cried in silence, while Sara accompanied him, asking, "Daddy, Daddy, why are you crying? Where's Mommy? Why did you lie and say she would be okay?" However, John couldn't find the answers to her questions. After his wife's death, he did everything possible to ensure a dignified life for Sara, working overtime at the factory and earning the respect of his superiors. One day, while on his way to work, a thin and pale boy approached John and said, "Excuse me, sir, I feel ashamed to ask, but do you have any money to spare? I'm very hungry." John noticed that the boy was genuinely ashamed, something that was not common in a beggar. So, he opened his wallet and realized he only had a few coins and a $20 bill. After reflecting for a few seconds, he gave the bill to the boy and also offered him the sandwiches that would be his lunch at the factory. "You can take it, kid. I work at that factory over there. I'll figure it out. It won't be the first time. Thank you, sir. I will repay you," the boy said with tears in his eyes. John smiled at him and headed towards the factory. He didn't know that, at that moment, the boy had made a promise to himself to find him and pay him back. That night, John returned home hungry, having only drunk water for lunch. The boy's name who had asked for money was Bernardo, and his family situation was really difficult, as his parents were alcoholics and didn't seem to care about him much. 10 years had passed like days. John was promoted due to his hard work and bought a bicycle for Sara. She would spend entire afternoons cycling with her friends around the neighborhood, jumping ramps, skidding on the sidewalk, and, on one day, while competing in a race in an alley, Sara lost her balance and crashed hard into the curb. Her friends were frightened when they realized that Sara was conscious, but unable to get up. Some people approached, called an ambulance, and phoned John, who rushed out of work. "What happened to my daughter?" John asked the doctor. "Currently, her life is not in danger. However, we have a problem," the doctor said, struggling to find the right words. "Unfortunately, the girl has a broken spine and probably won't be able to walk again." Noticing John's desperation, he said, "Don't lose hope. There are specialized hospitals in the capital that offer advanced treatments for musculoskeletal injuries. However, these treatments are extremely expensive and can cost millions, depending on the required time." "I can't afford that," John murmured. The doctor fell silent. A month later, Sara was discharged, and it was now her responsibility to learn to move well with the wheelchair and adapt to life as a person with a disability. In the following years, John sacrificed any leisure options and saved every penny that was left after paying the bills. In the meantime, Sara became a beautiful woman and would have won several beauty contests if it weren't for the wheelchair. John fell into depression after failing to raise funds for his daughter's treatment, losing all hope. However, in a moment when he had already given up on everything, someone knocked on his door. When he opened it, he was faced with a well-dressed young man, looking to be around 30 years old, who introduced himself as someone John did not know. The young man opened his wallet, which only contained a $20 bill. He extended the note towards John and, at that moment, everything became clear to him. Looking into the young man's eyes, John realized that the shy look from 20 years ago had disappeared. The young man was now there, 20 years older and radiating confidence. Bernardo asked if he could come in and introduced himself by name. That was when Sara appeared in the room in her wheelchair and smiled kindly to greet the visitor. Bernardo became embarrassed and his face immediately turned red, but he soon composed himself and asked how John was doing. The young man had not forgotten how John treated him 20 years ago. Now, after having become successful as a big businessman, he had decided to look him up. During that period, Bernardo lived in the capital city and only returned to the small municipality to fulfill a promise he had made in the past, to pay off a debt. He remembered that John worked at the factory and was able to obtain the address he needed there. What he did not expect was to find a man with serious problems and a daughter with a disability. When Bernardo heard about Sara's physical problem and the possible solutions, he thought for a moment and said, "John, perhaps you don't know this, but many years ago you saved me. At that time, $20 were as or more important to me than $200,000 or $2 million now. That's why I'm going to reimburse you proportionally and cover all the costs of Sara's treatment." The room fell silent as John seemed unable to believe what was happening. Sara approached and hugged Bernardo, causing tears to well up in the young businessman's eyes. He remembered when, at 9 years old, he used to ask for money from the same man who could now help. 3 weeks later, after a successful surgery, Sara took her first steps on her own. During this emotional moment, John held one of Sara's hands while Bernardo held the other. Bernardo was in love with Sara and planned to ask for her hand in marriage soon. John cried tears of joy, for the first time in years, and said that these tears were much more welcome than those of sadness and longing.